I'm Nguyen Phan, and my question is to what extent is Rivers regenerated in the novel? Regeneration is a motif of the novel Regeneration by Pat Barker. Regeneration, in the context of this novel, is the process of regrowing and finding oneself again, whether it is physical or mental. Barker used dreams to convey this motif, since dreams often reflect a person's conscience and their feelings. The character who is regenerated by a considerable amount is Rivers. In Chapter 5, Barker accounted Rivers' dream where he was carrying out an experiment with Henry Head. They were trying to regenerate nerves on Head's arm. This is based on an event that did happen when Rivers was still working in Oxford. As Rivers tried to map the area of hypersensitivity to pain, Head's suffering became larger than he could handle, and so he snatched a scalpel and sliced Rivers' arm, telling Rivers to try the pain that he is going through. Through this dream, Rivers' conscience is comparing the pain of Head's regenerating nerves to the soldier's regenerating mental illness. That in advising the soldiers to remember the traumatic events that had led them to Craig Lockhart, Rivers is in effect inflicting pain on his patients. This comes to show that regeneration is a physically painful experience. In order to regenerate the soldiers, Rivers requires them to accept their fears, that it is nothing to be ashamed of. He insists his patients to accept that tears were an acceptable and helpful part of grieving. However, all of which Rivers asks of his patients are setting himself against the whole tenor of their upbringing. Since society during World War I, which is the Edwardian period, are strictly patriarchal, they were taught to identify emotional repressions as the essence of manliness. What Rivers is asking his patients to do would seem to be emasculating themselves. Furthermore, Rivers does realize that his treatment is still largely experimental, meaning that there is still no guarantee of success. Even as their psychiatrist, or Freud, Rivers has no way of empathizing with what the soldiers are going through. This puts Rivers in the role of a torturer in the eyes of the soldiers, a torturer who delivers pain sadistically without an understanding where the pain is coming from. After coming into encounter with Yelland and his barbaric method of curing the soldiers, Rivers had another dream. In this dream, he stumbled upon a deformed man who was clinging to the rail. The man's eyes swiveled as he opened his mouth and quoted Sassoon's letter to the board, the Declaration. Barker describes the deformed man clinging to the rail, making it seem as if he is holding onto the rail in fear of Rivers and attaching himself to the rail and not wanting to let go of his fears. As the dream progresses, it becomes more vivid. Rivers saw himself in the electrocution room with a patient strapped onto the chair, just like Callan was bound to the chair when Yellen was treating him. Rivers could see the patient's delicately quivering uvula, his yellowish greeny surface of the tongue, and the tonsils were like great swollen blue-purple eggs. Through the use of descriptive and emotive language, Barker depicts a horrifying image to the readers of this tortured patient. As Rivers was forcing the man's mouth open, he realized that he was using a horse's bit, not an electrode, not a teaspoon, but the instrument used to silence recalcitrant women in the Middle Ages, and more recently on American slaves. It is an instrument of control. The bit symbolizes the dehumanization of the soldiers as Rivers and Yellen cure them, taking away their right of speech, of protest. Despite the fact that both dreams all have elements of sadistic behavior on Rivers' part, there is a clear difference between his attitudes towards treating the soldiers. During the first dream, Rivers is very analytical about his dream, examining every aspect of the dream, supporting Freud's contention that all dreams were wish fulfillment. He detached himself from the situation, not using any emotive language to describe his feelings towards this dream. When analyzing his dream, his first thought is of the experiment he's left behind with Henry Head at Oxford. Then onto the soldiers he was inflicting mental torment upon. He has a professional selfishness that he hasn't that he hasn't gotten a grasp upon the sufferings of the soldiers that and they are merely scientific subjects to him. However, in his second dream, after seeing Burns' mental breakdown and Yellen's persecution on the soldiers, Rivers has changed. The first difference is that his dream is interlaced with the reality of his psychiatric job right now, trying to treat a patient and not simply a wish fulfillment of wanting to be back at Oxford, continuing his research. The language in which he recounted his dream is less scientific and concentrates more on the alarming image of the patient. It is as if he is accepting the pains of war, whereas before he has turned a blind eye on it, just wanting to do his job and not have to think about what his job actually entails. It could be described as ironic that Rivers' job is to regenerate these soldiers just so they could be sent back to the war, where they got their mental breakdown from in the first place. But it is also paradoxical that Rivers was actually the one who was regenerated in his thoughts and feelings towards the war. In spite of Rivers' regeneration, he still has to be in Craiglockhart to cure these soldiers, silencing their protests of the war, and send them back to the bloodbath. There is nothing he can do. Perhaps Pat Barker is trying to communicate that regeneration is a time-consuming and painful experience, but might not be worth it.